What's your definition of poetry?
Sure, that's it's a very hard thing to define. I think the closest I can get to it is that poetry is a dance between words and meaning and something close to music. A definition that I really, really like is I heard 1 year from the poet laureate of South Africa, Gorapetso Hositsile, and he said that poetry is the highest register of language as expressed through the texture of life. So I really like that one, but I think it's very difficult. It's an incredibly difficult thing to define. But you know a poem when you hear it. You know a real poem when you hear it. And I think there's also has to be another layer to it. Is the idea of reality being infused in the meaning of the poem. There has to be some blood on it. There has to be some guts on it. There has to be something very, very real that reaches into the human soul and the human heart and touches it. Yeah.
Who are your influences in your poetry?
Oh gosh, I absolutely love Hositsile. I love Audre Lorde. I love Stevie Wonder. I love Lauryn Hill. I love Shakespeare. There's so many people, so many people. But I think I tend to also be drawn to musicians who see themselves as writers. Who aspire to write things that are meaningful and that are complete and that are rich with metaphor and that have layers. I like literature that is music, but I also like music that is literature. I like writers that I can read and hear the musical quality in their work. You hear that in Don Matera. You hear that in a lot of African writers, which is what makes this continent particularly an inspiring place to live and to work. Having all these like oral textures and these musical textures to draw from as well makes it very, very exciting.
What's your take on the South African poetry scene?
I think the South African poetry scene is incredibly vibrant, most of the world and I guess the literary, fraternity regards poetry as kind of like the stepchild, the highbrow stepchild, you hear things like anywhere in the world where you go, a volume of poetry should only sell 1,000 copies, so I mean poets in the world generally are people who are incredibly passionate about what they do because they believe in their hearts that there's a small audience for what they do. But the unique thing about South Africa is that we've got this incredible oral tradition. So it makes it possible for poetry to seep into the mainstream in ways that are impossible in other parts of the world, And in addition to that, we've also got this incredible first world media. And you've also got a climate in this country where people are trying to figure out what it means to be a South African. So they're willing to experiment with different things, and use the media to experiment with different things, which makes it possible for poetry to live in spaces that traditionally in other parts of the world it can't live or it wouldn't live. I think this is an incredibly dynamic and rich environment, especially at this moment in which to be a poet. Over the last 10 years, since I've been doing what I do, I've seen writers, really wonderful, beautiful writers pop up from every corner of this country. And I love the fact that now when you go to just about any major city, there's a poetry community. There's, Joburg has it, Pretoria has it, Durban has it, Cape Town has it. And people don't give up, people create their own spaces without funding, without support from government, but somehow it carries on. I wish it would translate into more support for literature, for literacy. I wish it would translate into a bigger culture of reading. A lot of what I'm talking about is performance driven. It's driven by the stage and clubs and spaces where people can go and hear and see poetry. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but I wish that that fed more into people reading poetry, you know? Mm-hmm. But for now, this is a great start. I think this is probably one of the best places in the world to be a poet.
Okay. Do you think the younger generation is really focused on performance versus print-based poetry?
I think so. I think the younger generation is definitely far more focused on performance, on being famous, on being well-known than they are on books, which is very problematic. It's highly problematic, but I think it's one of the unfortunate legacies of our history of living in a society that is vastly unequal, where most people, you know, that have access to education that is desperately inferior, you know. 52% of the country is functionally illiterate, you know. How do you create a culture of reading in a society where people can't read, you know? How do you create a culture of reading in a society where books are so expensive? We pay more for books in this country than people pay in the UK, in the US, in countries where people have money, you know. So the idea of reading for most people is very alienating, you know. And that's something that we have to work very hard to get past, you know. But I don't necessarily think that should be the job of writers, you know. That should be the job of education, the education system. That should be the job of government. That should be the job of people who are in power, who are supposed to be trying to create a society of well-informed, critically thinking, creative people who can bring more to South Africa in terms of productivity and intellectual capital. You know, we can only benefit from having a reading society. So unfortunately, the writers who are coming up, you know, they're on the receiving end of all of this, you know, complicated mess, you know. And the access that they have to poetry is usually through TV or through the live space or through radio, you know, and they see it as a way of kind of being famous, you know. It's part of the celebrity culture, which is dodgy at best.
Okay, my last question is, we spoke about writers. What's your take on writing in English versus whatever your mother tongue is, especially for African poets?
I think it's the English versus African language question is a very loaded and it's a heavy debate, and it's an old debate, you know. I think it's problematic to live in a society where the hegemony of English is so powerful and so in your face, you know, at the expense of particularly Black people, you know. I wish in my heart of hearts that I could write in my mother tongue, you know. I learned how to speak my mother tongue phonetically because I grew up outside of this country. I never learned to read and write in it. But I believe in my heart of hearts that there's a part of me, a fundamental part of me that translates consistently from that mother tongue, you know, that there are concepts and ideas and ways of thinking and being that inform my writing that exist in Sesotho that I bring into English, you know. Of course, it benefits English. What excites me about the spoken word movement is seeing so many writers who are able to move fluidly between 1 or 2 or 4 or 5 languages in the same poem, you know. I find that incredibly refreshing and incredibly exciting, and also very reflective of who we are and how we really speak, you know, how we live. That for me is the cutting edge text. That is the new text. But will the publishing industry catch up to that? You know, do they even understand that? South Africa is it's a white dominated, English dominated society, you know, from every level, and most importantly from the economic level, you know. So the battle with English is a much bigger battle than just the language. It's about fighting a mentality, a way of being. It's about fighting for your survival, really, you know. You need English to be able to open a bank account. You need English to get an ID. You need English to do a job where you sit at a desk and look out of a window, you know. It's so, to tell people in the face of all of that to be confident about writing in their mother tongues is difficult. But when I see African writers who do choose to write in their mother tongues, when I see the way that they are able to communicate to Black people, to African people, it's undeniable that there is so much more power in that, you know. So I encourage that. That's what I encourage. That's what I support. But it's difficult to do that being me, writing in English with an American accent. You know, people. The contradiction and is there. It's apparent. But you know, my story is my story. It's not anybody else's story, and it's not the story of the kid who's growing up in Gugulet who chooses to write in broken English because they think that's what is going to make them be heard, as opposed to writing in Xhosa that they know and love and feel and understand. For me, that's unfortunate.
Thank you, Lebo.
You're very welcome.